today.
And only you can decide what you want this country to be, what you want to do with the future.
Just call me Snake Eyes.
Vote like your whole world depended on it.
Voters should not be forced to go to the polls with their fingers crossed.
They understand what peace demands.
What America needs are leaders to match the greatness of her people.
Campaign appearances are getting closer and closer together as each candidate tries to get in his best shot.
Vote. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
It's going to get dirtier in these last few days.
No apologies, no regrets. We will not be coerced. We will not tolerate being pushed around.
All right. How many of you, well, actually, let me say it this way. If this is your first time at Hope, what we normally do around here when I preach is we'll look at a topic or an idea, and we'll spend several weeks talking about it. We call it a sermon series, where maybe there's something that we all have in common as human beings, or maybe there's a section of the Bible I want to talk about for a few weeks, and we'll dig down into it deeply. But today, I'm doing something that is a little bit out of the ordinary. I'm taking one topic, and I'm talking about it for one Sunday, and then we're moving on. So you caught the good Sunday where you get to say, I remember that sermon, because it's not going to be part of a series. And for this Sunday only, I'm going to talk about the state of politics in America. And the reason why I'm doing this for 1 week is because when I look around our country and the way that people approach politics, it's just toxic, and it impacts all of us in so many ways. But I'm only spending 1 week on it because I think I can say everything that needs to be said in only 1 week, and you guys probably don't want to talk about politics for more than 1 week anyway. In fact, I want to take the temperature of the audience. I want to kind of see where everyone's at with this topic to let me know how early I should let you out today. How many of you already know who you're going to be voting for in November? How many of you already have a candidate? You already know who? Okay. How many of you know who you're not voting for in November? Anybody? Okay, definitely more hands there at this point. How many of you love the chaos and the madness that is an election year? How many of you really like this stuff? Okay, how many of you can't wait for November 8th to come and go and be beyond it? How many of you are hoping Jesus comes back and the world ends before November 8th? Okay, a lot of people with that one. How many of you hate it when political conversations come up in conversations? You just hate it? Okay. How many of you are the one bringing up the political conversation in conversations? Okay. How many of you believe that a church shouldn't talk about politics? Okay, that's interesting. So, based on your feedback, this might be the worst idea I've ever had as a preacher, but you already have your program, so I can't really stop it at this point. We're just going to go forward with it. Have you noticed that every 4 years, this election infection kind of is a pandemic that sweeps through our country? And I don't know about you, but it seems like every 4 years, it gets a little bit worse. Things get a little more toxic. There's more criticism. There's more mudslinging. There's more name-calling, there's more division, and that's not the candidates, that's the citizens, that's us. It's more divisive every time we go through a presidential election cycle. And of course, the media has a field day with that. They're trying to attract eyeballs, so they look for the headlines that are going to attract the most eyeballs, and it's usually things that get us fired up about politics, and the candidates are all trying to do a good job of showing the world that the other person is going to destroy our country if that person becomes president. And so by the end of the election cycle, we're all convinced that candidate A or candidate B is going to ruin our country, and it's all just going to be terrible. We all get worked up and frustrated about it, and as a result, we get what I call election infection. It's where this pandemic, viral, definitely contagious disease seems to take over our country. Now, it's hard to recognize if you've contracted election infection, but you can recognize it in other people. And my goal today, by the way, is to inoculate you from election infection and to help you help others who've already gotten the disease. So here's the symptoms to look for in the people you love. No elbows. Here's the symptoms to look for in the people that you love. Yelling at the television, high blood pressure, a sense of hopelessness or despondency when the subject of politics comes up. If they get worried or check out or frustrated when politics comes up, maybe that's one of the symptoms. Here's some more. Listening to an excessive amount of talk radio, worry about the future, amplified opinions, they just get louder and louder and louder, and hearing loss. They just can't hear you. You just make a point that they're not listening. So if you notice some of these symptoms in you or someone that you love, they may have contracted election infection already. But it's not too late. Today, I'm going to show you how to overcome this terrible disease. And I think this is important for us who are Christians to get right. And if you're not a Christian and you're checking things out today, I'm so glad you're here, because I'm afraid that for too many decades, Christians in this country have done a poor job of representing Jesus when it comes to this topic. And if those of you who know me know that I really don't talk about politics much. There's several reasons why I typically don't go into this arena. Number one, it's actually illegal for a nonprofit to talk about or endorse a candidate from the stage, from the platform, so to speak. So I can't stand here and say, I think you should vote for so-and-so. You just can't do that. As a private citizen, I can on my own time, but even then, I don't really like endorsing candidates because I don't want to use my influence that I get from teaching the Bible to endorse a political candidate. I think those are different things. Another reason I really don't talk about politics a lot is because I don't get really interested or involved in it. Some of you who are political junkies out there, you say, well, you should be more interested in politics. That's really important. So before you judge me for not being into politics, there's an important reason why. In polite company, there's two topics you're not supposed to talk about. Politics and... What am I going to talk about if I get into politics? All right? I'm really glad Jason came to Thanksgiving this year. He didn't have much to say, So that's just not my thing, okay? If it's your thing, I'm not saying you should change your thing. I think that's great. It's just not my thing, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it today. I'm going to wade into this pool because I think it's so important for all of us to know how to navigate culture at a time like this in a God-honoring way, and especially for those of us who are Christians, to honor the name of Jesus and be the salt and light of the earth. So, I'm going to give you the whole sermon up front in two phrases. That way, if you get too mad because I'm not endorsing the right candidate or something like that, you'll still at least get the main message of the sermon today. Here's what it is. Number one, put God before government, and put people before politics. Put God before government, and put people before politics. If we will learn how to put God in a more predominant place in our hearts than the government, and learn how to put people first before our political ideology and opinions and persuasions, we will figure out how to navigate politics as Christians, and we will figure out how to avoid the disease of suffering from election infection and help others along the way as well. So let's start with the first one, put God before government. We're going to look at Psalm 146, verses 3 and following. We're going to look at a lot of verses today, but we're going to move pretty quickly, and they'll be printed in your program this morning. The Psalm says, do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. When their spirit departs, they return to the ground. On that very day, their plans come to nothing. So go back into ancient times. It says, do not put your trust in princes. What is a prince? Not a ruler. He's the son of the ruler who's going to become the next ruler. This is the guy who's about to become king. This is the guy who's about to take the reins of the government. This is the guy with his plans of change for the nation, of how the nation is going to get better, how the kingdom is going to get better, and he's got his agenda and he's got his plans, and the people get excited. This would be our candidates today, really. This is the guy, this is the gal who's got a new plan and a new agenda and is going to make our country better. The psalm writer says, don't put your trust in princes. Do you know why? They're human beings. They can't save you. They're going to die just like you. They're no different than you. They're human. So don't get too excited. Don't put your trust in them. Don't put your confidence in them. Their plans will inevitably come to nothing. Blessed are those whose help is in the God of Jacob. Now, later this summer, if you're going to be around, I'm going to talk through the life of Jacob in a sermon series. But what's interesting about the life of Jacob is that God came to Jacob and said, in spite of who you are, I will be with you, I will bless you, I will protect you. It's all about who God is, not who Jacob was. So put your hope in that God who comes to you and promises, I will forgive you, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, I will be with you always. Whose hope is in the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God. He is the maker of heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. He remains faithful forever. Don't put your trust in princes. Don't put your trust in humans that they're going to make everything better. Only God, who is maker, only God who reigns, only God who is sovereign, only God who is holy can support the weight of your trust. He continues, verse 7. He, the Lord, upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow, but He frustrates the way of the wicked. See, we have a tendency to look to government for all of these things. But the psalm writer says, no, ultimately, first and foremost, you look to the Lord for health. You look to the Lord for providence. You look to the Lord for protection. You look to the Lord for blessing in your life. So the first fill in the blank today is this. Oh, I'm sorry, one more verse. The Lord reigns forever, your God, O Zion, for all generations. So, he says, trust God before the government. Trust God before the government. Ultimately, your source of help, of hope, of salvation, of healing, of prosperity, all comes first and foremost from the Lord. People who get caught up and who contract election infection are putting too much weight on the government to deliver us, on the government to save us, on the government to be our hope. If you put your hope in the Lord, your trust in the Lord, then you'll be free from worry. Trust God before the government. Second tension, Romans chapter 13. It says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now, this was written by a guy named Paul, lived in the first century. He's writing it to Christians who lived in the ancient city of Rome. That's why it's called Romans. Not very creative, but you'll always be able to remember that now. And as he's writing them, he's saying you should be subject to the governing authorities. Follow their laws, obey their decrees, do whatever they say. He continues, consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. Now, here's what's interesting. If you go back in history, there was a certain emperor of Rome at this time when these Christians were reading this letter from Paul. It was a guy by the name of Nero. Nero was the guy who was insane. He was crazy. He set his own city on fire so he could build a racetrack. He persecuted Christians and had them killed by the hundreds and thousands. And Paul writes to them and says, this maniacal, depraved emperor you have, submit to the governing authorities. There's no authority except that which God has established. You say, well, how can that be? He's an evil man. Sure, people will always take good blessings from God and twist them for evil. That's the story of our lives, is it not? I mean, last week and the 2 weeks before that, I preached about money. Money's a good blessing from God. Why don't we enjoy it? Because we twist it and we don't use it for its intended purposes always. People do the same thing in government. If you want proof, look at a society that has no government. It erupts in anarchy. So even though wicked men will always twist government and use it for their personal or evil agendas, Paul still writes and God still endorses, but that's still an institution that is established by God. But we become fearful when we say, oh, but they're going to do evil. Oh, they're leading our country off track. Oh, if so-and-so is elected president, then the whole country is going to hell in a handbasket. That's what people who have election infection say. But they forgot something. Here's what they forgot. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. That's Jesus. In other words, there have always been kings, there have always been rulers who have said, we're not doing this God's way, and we're not doing it God's way on purpose. We are deliberately defying God. He said that's always been the case. It's always going to be the case. And here's what they're saying. Let us break off their chains and throw off their shackles. So they're saying, forget you, God. We're doing evil. How does God respond to that? Does he panic? Does he freak out? The one enthroned in heaven, what? He laughs. Anyone in any government office in any generation who wants to use that office for evil is like an ant threatening an elephant. I'm going to show you. What does the elephant do? Are you kidding me? See, you're enthroned on your nice throne there in your country. That's a nice throne. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. That's not all he does. The Lord, let's go back, after he laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. This is turning from laughter, like this is really funny, to now I'm going to mock you and inevitably destroy you. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king. See, you're a nice king, but there's a bigger king. He's the King of kings. He's Jesus Christ. And he will rule forever. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. When the ant threatens the elephant laughs, then he scoffs and he says, your judgment's coming. You see, when we get worried about who gets into office and who becomes president and who becomes governor and who becomes mayor and all these political things we worry about, and they're going to ruin our whole country, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. Because we lose sight of the fact that God will always accomplish his good and holy and perfect will on earth. And it doesn't matter who the emperor is, it doesn't matter who the king is, it doesn't matter who the president is, it doesn't matter who the prime minister is, doesn't matter. God will do his will, and he has a history of doing his will. In the days of Moses, there was an evil man on the throne, a Pharaoh. And he refused to do the right thing, and he oppressed an entire ethnicity in slavery, in cruel bondage, and he wouldn't release them, he wouldn't free them, he wouldn't treat them with dignity or respect. He abused them, and he was evil, and God said, I don't care who's king. I'm going to do my will. Whether he's aligned with me or against me, I'm going to do my will. In the time of a Roman Empire, there was a powerful emperor. He was named Caesar Augustus. And in his pride and in his arrogance, he decided, I'm going to issue a decree and see how big my empire is. In his greed, he said, I want to see how much more I can tax people. And God said, you're full of pride and arrogance and greed? I can work with that to accomplish my will. I'm going to make sure a guy and his wife get to the town of Bethlehem they need to get to so that my son can be born. God doesn't care who's president, because God will do his will, whether they are trying to work with God or whether they are trying to work against God. The will of the Lord will be done. So, here's what we learn from these verses. Fear God before the government. Fear God before the government. People who become afraid of who's going to be the next president have lost sight of the sovereignty and majesty and power of God. If you become fearful, oh no, they're going to ruin our country, don't lose sight that God is holy, that he is gracious, that he is compassionate, and that he loves people, and his will be accomplished whether or not the president wants to work with him or against him. God sits enthroned. And so we fear God before the government. We hold God in reverence, in awe, in wonder, in worship. We bow before him, and that puts government in its proper perspective. His will be accomplished. Okay, you tracking with me so far? We trust God before the government. We fear God before the government. There's one more way we put God before government. Titus chapter 3 says this, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good. So Titus was a pastor. Paul wrote him a letter. He told him to remind the people, so I'm going to remind you, obey the laws, obey the government, do what's right. That's our duty as Christians. Those of us who are Christians, we believe it's a spiritual duty to obey laws and government. Yet the balance is in Acts chapter 5. We must obey God rather than men. So as our country inches closer and closer and closer to commanding people to sin, okay, either directly against what Scripture teaches or at the very least against your conscience, as we get closer and closer to that edge, people who follow Jesus say, I will respect, I will obey, I will comply with the government. Unless they tell me to sin, then I obey God first. Okay, He's the King of Kings, you're just a president. He's the King of Kings, you're just a governor. He's the King of Kings. So I'll obey you because He tells me to, unless you are telling me to defy the one I answer to with my eternity. So that's our third point. We obey God before government. Obey God before government. This is the way you put God before government. You trust God, and He's trustworthy. He sent Jesus to be your Savior. We can trust Him with our eternities, so we can trust Him with what's going to happen in the next 4 years. Trust God before government. Fear God before government. Obey God before government. As you do these things, you will begin to inoculate yourself from election infection, because when you remember who God is, it'll put politics in the proper size and context. All right, tracking with me so far? If that makes sense so far, say yes. All right, 80% of you are totally getting with it. Now we're going to get to the second half. Put people before politics, all right? Matthew 22. In context is some Pharisees were hanging around with Jesus. They didn't like Jesus because they weren't sure what to make of Him, but they were all religious, and Jesus claimed to be from God. So they're asking Him theological questions. They're asking Him about God. And it says one of them, an expert in the law, that would be Old Testament law, as in he had Genesis through Malachi, all 39 books of the Old Testament. He had them nailed down cold. He's an expert. He's a Bible teacher. Tested him, Jesus, with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? So of all the things we find, what's the most important commandment, Jesus? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, we love this answer, don't we? Because no one can check up on your answer. Do you love God with all your heart? Oh, yeah, I love Him so much. Do you love Him with all your soul? Yeah, I don't even know what that means. I do. You know I do. Love Him with all your mind. Oh, yeah, He's always on my mind. No one can actually, this is great, no one can check up on you. Yeah, I love God first. He's most important. In fact, you could go to any of the presidential candidates still remaining and say, do you love God? And in their vague, politically correct way, I bet they'll all say, of course I do. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is great, but before they can even take a breath, before they can ask a question, Jesus finishes the answer, because the answer isn't done yet. He said, and the second, no, we just asked for one. Jesus said, no, you don't understand. And the second is like it, as in, you can't have the first without the second. They're connected. You can have the first, but it always is trailed by a second. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, it will show itself by the fact that you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this is the one we don't like, because we would rather have Jesus say, love your neighbor the way your neighbor deserves to be loved, or love your neighbor the way and in accordance with the way your neighbor treated you, or treat your neighbor's kids the way their kids treated your lawn. We were looking for all kinds of other ways to deal with this except the way Jesus said. The way we show and demonstrate tangibly in our lives, do you love God with all your heart and soul and mind, is do you love your neighbor as yourself? And he makes it even more clear. Let's go back a slide. All the law and the prophets hang on, are hinged on, are connected to These two commands. In other words, Jesus says, if you're ever in a situation, any situation in life, and you're not sure what the right thing to do is morally, you're not sure what the right thing to do is ethically, there might be a verse about this, but I don't know. It's a big Bible. I don't know what it says. He says, here's your compass. Love God first, and with it, you love people the way you love yourself. All the laws, all the commands hang on these two verses. So those of us who are Christians, those of us who are trusting Christ for our salvation, here's the point. Love others before your perspective. I've got my opinions and I love my opinions. I've got my perspective and I love my perspective. But since I love God, I'm going to love you more than I love my perspective. I'm going to love you and care about you more than I love and care about my opinion. That's how you put people before politics. You love them more than you love your opinion and more than you love your perspective. Now, imagine if for just a minute, what if between now and November 8th, what if every single person in America said, okay, 5.5 months, I'll do that. I will love my neighbor as myself. What would it be like to live in America if every citizen decided to do that? We wouldn't need police. We wouldn't need judges. We wouldn't need charities. We would hardly need the church. Because everyone would always be doing and saying and praying for each other what we needed to be done and what we needed to hear. You say, well, that's nice to think about, Jason, but that's not even possible. Okay, fine, granted. What would it be like if just the Christians in America said, for the next 5.5 months, I am going to put people before politics. I am going to love my neighbor as myself. And here's why I ask. Most political candidates and politicians, this won't come as a surprise to you, they're not necessarily the thermostats that set the temperature for the nation. They're the thermometers that read the temperature of the nation. Okay? What candidates are trying to do is catch the culture of the prevailing wind of culture, because that's how you get elected. Wherever the culture is blowing, that's where they put up their sail, because that's where they can capture the most votes and get elected into office. America always gets the president it votes for. Okay? We always get the governor we vote for. We always get the mayor we vote for. We always get the senators we vote for. Whoever gets elected, that's a thermometer more than a thermostat about where our culture is at and where the cultural winds are blowing. What if the wind started blowing in a different direction? And the direction was, I'm going to love people more than I love politics, my opinions, my perspectives. You say, but there aren't enough Christians. No, what if we decided we're going to create a counterculture within the culture? We're going to create a crosswind within the prevailing wind. And before you say, well, I don't know if that'll make a difference, last week we talked about this. Well, when you look at what you have in your hands, and it's not enough to move the needle, but when you put it in Jesus' hands and honor Him with it, He multiplies that. And you get to unleash the miracle. So what would happen if just those of us who are Christians said, Jesus, I'm trusting you with my salvation. You've done everything for me. You are for me and you are with me. I'm going to show my love for you by loving others the way you love me. That could change things. That could definitely move the needle. Now, for the last little bit here, I just want to get really practical, nuts and bolts. So there's something, because so far, I mean, what do you do with that? Like, yeah, all right, yeah, sure, I should trust God before government. I should put people before politics. So there's really no pushback against that. What I want to do is I want to get really practical, because what's probably going to happen between now and November is you're going to be in some contentious conversations, or you're going to bump into some people, maybe even in your small group, those of you who are at Hope, who have very different political opinions than you do, and that's fine. I believe you can be a Jesus follower first and a Republican second. I believe you can be a Jesus follower first and a Democrat second. I think you can be a Jesus follower first and a Libertarian second, or whatever your political persuasion is. Okay, and I think we can have lots of different political views in the room, and that's fine, and I'm not asking you to change your political views, but I want to get really practical with how to apply what we've been talking about this morning. While we all have our views and we all have our opinions, there are people who hold opinions that are different than yours. If you are ever in a conversation with someone, or if you are ever watching the television and you just don't understand, how could someone hold to that ideology? How could someone have that political opinion? How could someone possibly think that? The answer is, the reason why they can think that or believe that or have that opinion is because there's something about them that you don't know. It doesn't mean they're right, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but there's something about them that you do not know. Because here, maybe you've noticed this. You have your opinions for a reason. You have a view of the world, you have a perspective, and you have it for a reason. It's based on your beliefs. It's based on your values. It's based on your experiences. Your outlook of the world is shaped by a number of factors. And when someone is expressing a political opinion or a political perspective, that's the destination they've arrived at. You have no idea the journey that took them there. So when you're talking to someone and you don't understand, how did you get to, how do you think that? Why do you think that's right? And you just don't understand, before you argue, before you debate, why don't you stop and recognize, there's something here I don't understand. And you have an opportunity to learn, because I think those of us who are Christians, when it comes to having political differences, we should be the most curious people in the room. We should be the most confident people in the room. We should be the most compassionate people in the room. We should be confident because you believe that your eternity is secure. You believe that there is a sovereign God in heaven who knows your name and has the number of hairs on your very head numbered. You can be confident. You don't need to be insecure because someone disagrees with you. Those of us who are Christians, we can be confident. Those of us who are Christians can be curious because we're not threatened by other opinions or perspectives that the world offers. We can be students. We can be students of culture, students of opinion, students of perspective, because we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And one of the things we do is we want to take every thought captive and make it obedient to the truth of Christ and who He is. So be curious. How did you form that opinion? I want to know. We should be compassionate because we've received so much compassion from God in our lives. So, when someone has a position that you just have no idea how anyone in the world can believe that, here's the question for you to ask. Rather than debate, rather than get all bowed up, rather than get ready to launch the missiles of why your political position is right, ask this question. What led you to that view? What led you to that view? Because that view is the destination. What led you to that view? Because when you are willing to listen to their story, you are showing love and respect for the individual. And Jesus called us to love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not saying you should agree with their view. I'm not saying you should change your view. I'm saying you should be curious and be a student about what led them to that view. So can you still have your political perspectives and be involved in politics? Absolutely, go for it. Can you still yell at your television when things come on? Absolutely, go for it. I think you should yell. Should you ever sacrifice influence over politics? Should you risk relational influence over politics? Now, this is an important one. And let me tell you why it's important. Everyone spends eternity somewhere, but it isn't in Washington, D.C. There will be a time in your life, in your future, when the political opinions you feel so strongly about and fiery about today will not matter a bit to you. All right? As a pastor, I've been into a number of hospital rooms, sat beside a number of hospital beds, and been near people when they are close to death. And no one has ever said, Jason, could you please read a few paragraphs from the Declaration of Independence for me? No one has ever said, Jason, would you just get out the Constitution and read through some of the amendments for me? No one has asked that, because in that moment, you suddenly realize what's more important than your political view. And what is it? It's your faith in God and your eternity with Him. And here's the other reason why you shouldn't lose influence in a relationship over a political issue. Because in America, your opinion doesn't matter. Okay? Your opinion plus $2 buys you a cup of coffee. But take away the $2, it doesn't matter. Your vote matters in America. We are blessed because you get to vote, and your vote matters. Your opinion doesn't matter for anything. So why lose influence unnecessarily when you want to leverage all of your influence on what matters forever? Why lose influence on politics so your neighbor, your coworker, your family worker, your friend, when something eternal comes up, they're not going to want to go to you because you lost your influence over something that isn't going to matter after November 8th? Don't sacrifice influence unnecessarily. Build as much relational capital as you can so you can be the salt and light of the earth. So people can see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven on the day that Jesus returns. That's where you want to spend all your relationship capital, not on your opinion. So here's how we're going to sum up today, our last fill in the blank. Put your faith before your politics. Put your faith before your politics. What that means is trust God before government, fear God before government, obey God before government, and love people more than you love your opinions and perspectives. And when you put your faith first, you can have a lot of different political persuasions next, because you know what? No one political persuasion has it all right. But they're worried about earthly kingdoms, and that's important. But before you're worried about earthly kingdoms, be consumed with God's kingdom. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and He'll work out the rest. And if we do this, if we put our faith before our politics, not only will you become immune to election infection, you'll gain influence in the world so that people can glorify Jesus. And that's what I want for you. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, I want to confess our sin as a people. Our sin is that we are not thankful and appreciative for a government which you have established. Especially for those of us who live in a country that it's better than pretty much any other opportunity out there. Thank you for our country. Thank you for our government. I ask that you will bless all of our nation's leaders with your wisdom, with your love, that their hearts will be more aligned with yours. I pray for the candidates in this presidential election, that they would grow in fear of you, in love for you. Sovereign God, we are thankful that no matter who becomes president, your kingdom will come and your will be done. For we who are listening today, I ask that we will always trust you, fear you, obey you, love you more than any institution on this earth. I ask that we will be wise in the way we talk about politics so that we can gain influence, so that we can be the salt and light of the earth. You put us here to heal, to preserve, to point people to you in your kingdom. So wherever this lands with us, Lord, give us the wisdom to know how to apply this and the temperance to do it. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.